A winter's mercy. Winter arrived ahead of schedule that season, gentle and deliberate like vapor against glass, wrapping the hillside in complete stillness. Even the horses moved with greater care, their steps muffled by the pristine white carpet. It was evening on a Sunday when Calder Boone heard the saloon's rear door slam against the wooden frame with unusual force. He kept his eyes fixed on his drink, refusing to glance toward the newcomer. But the sudden hush that descended over the poker players revealed this wasn't an ordinary visitor. "Better go see what's pleading for scraps near the meat shop," a voice muttered from the bar area. "Ain't any stray animal." Calder placed his metal cup down deliberately. He hadn't uttered a complete thought since the previous Friday. The flames at his feet whispered and crackled as though eavesdropping. Beyond the walls, wind tugged at the town's edges, causing ropes to sway freely from porch supports and laundry to freeze solid on the lines. Calder had no need for a jacket. He'd been numb in deeper ways for far too long to notice the cold. In the alley behind the butcher's establishment, where refuse had crystallized into the earth and wooden containers spilled over with remnants and scraps, 5 young souls huddled like phantoms. The tallest among them, a girl whose age exceeded her frame, with braids laced with frost, used her sleeve to brush snow from a hardened piece of bread. A small boy at her side licked a cheese rind more from habit than hunger. Another child stood without footwear. Then a woman emerged from the shadows. Her hair lay matted beneath a bonnet stiff with grime. She remained silent, but when her gaze met Calder's, something within him, something he'd believed had perished, stirred from its resting place. The eldest girl rose and confronted him directly. "Might we receive your scraps?" she requested, as if borrowing phrases she'd practiced silently. Calder studied the children before him. None appeared older than a decade. An infant rested in the woman's embrace, barely covered. The snow seemed oblivious to their presence. So had the entire town. "You there, mother?" he inquired, his voice rough and weathered. The woman offered a slight nod, her lips chapped and split. He removed his hat, not from kindness, but as acknowledgement that he truly saw them. Without another word, he turned and crossed the street. Upon his return, he carried a cloth sack, bread, dried meat, apples that had softened but remained edible. He didn't offer it to the mother. Instead, he handed it to the girl who had spoken. Ruth, her name would eventually become. He didn't know it then, but the way her hands shook as she accepted the sack would remain with him through 3 harsh winters. "You have shelter?" he asked after a pause. The woman shifted nervously, glancing back at the silhouettes of her children. "No," she whispered. He nodded once. "Mine's beyond the chapel. Crimson roof, cracked beam, not heated, but it stays dry." She didn't express gratitude, simply turned and gathered the children like leaves scattered by wind. He observed their departure. One child stumbled. The infant made a sound that wasn't quite weeping. The falling snow erased their tracks before he finished drawing breath. By dawn, the town had discovered its voice again. "Did you witness who's occupying Boone's stable? 5 of them, filthy as cellar rodents. She was Pastor Mercer's daughter, recall. Hazel eloped with that gambling man. What was his name? Earl Summers. Cruel as a soaked boot. Assumed she had died. Should have remained that way." Calder heard every whisper from the merchant's steps where he purchased hardware and grain weekly. He offered no response, simply placed his coins with work-hardened fingers and walked back into the bitter air. That afternoon, he inspected the stable. The door groaned under frost's weight. Inside, warmth existed only in their breath, rising slowly from where they clustered beneath canvas and straw. Hazel sat erect, spine rigid, eyes vigilant. The baby pressed against her chest. The children slept in clusters, small backs against smaller chests, arms embracing one another. "Didn't expect you'd return," she said quietly. "I did." He reached into his coat and deposited a bundle, 2 covers, a tin of beans, a jar of fat. One of the children stirred, a boy, perhaps 6 years old. His eyes were alert, but he remained silent. Hazel didn't introduce them. Calder didn't inquire. "You planning to leave?" he asked after a moment. Hazel looked down, uncertain where we'd go. Silence expanded. Calder leaned against the post. His boots were damp. He was indifferent. They won't leave you be, he said. Town doesn't forget things that make them feel superior. Hazel smiled thinly as wind. I stopped expecting their compassion years ago. That evening, Calder repaired the stable door's hinges. No one requested it. He simply did it. He told himself it was for the animals, though none had resided there since spring. He awakened to children's laughter. He hadn't heard it in so long it took time to recognize. Like a bird's call from a forgotten land. Ruth and another girl were playing with string, creating shapes with their fingers, whispering rules only they understood. Hazel was combing out the girl's hair with a wooden comb, missing teeth. The baby nursed silently beneath a wrap. Calder watched from the porch. He noticed Ruth pause to look at him, then wave. He raised his hand in return. Later that day, Hazel approached with the boy who hadn't spoken. This is Jonas, she said. He doesn't talk, but he observes everything. Calder knelt to the boy's height. That's so? Jonas nodded solemnly. You notice the woodpile's getting low? Calder asked, gesturing. Jonas looked, nodded again. Think you can assist with that? Another nod. Hazel blinked rapidly as if battling something in her chest. Thank you, she said quietly. He stood, brushing off his knees. Want to remain longer? The roof needs repairs before spring. Hazel searched his face. You offering employment or charity? Neither, he said, just space. She hesitated. People will gossip. They always do. That evening, Hazel scrubbed the stable floor. Calder left a bucket of soap and a proper brush without comment. When he returned, she was humming. The melody was ancient, something about rivers and promises. Her voice was worn, but filled with warmth. The children were asleep in a corner, curled together beneath patched quilts Calder hadn't used in years. He gazed at them for a long while. The youngest, Mabel, still clutched a bread crust in one hand, untouched, as if she didn't dare believe it was truly hers. She hoards what's given, Hazel noticed, always afraid it'll be taken. Calder cleared his throat. Ain't right. No, she agreed, but it's what she knows. He looked at her, then really looked. Her face bore lines no woman of 28 should carry. Her hands were cracked. Her eyes, though dulled, still held the depth of a river that hadn't frozen yet. He walked back to the house, firelight flickering in the windows. Inside, the silence didn't comfort him as it used to. It just echoed. The next morning, Ruth waited outside his porch. You left your coat, she said, holding it out. Mama says it's too fine for us. He took it from her, folded it under one arm. You ain't trash, he said suddenly. She blinked up at him, uncertain. Don't let anyone tell you different. She nodded, but as she turned, he saw how her shoulders curved inward, as if accustomed to being small. He watched her walk back across the snow-covered yard. No shoes again. And that night he placed a pair of boots outside the stable. Small, well-worn, but intact. He didn't say they were from him. Hazel didn't say she knew. The town didn't stop talking, but they spoke quieter when Calder passed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his fists. He just looked them in the eye. By the third night, the baby didn't cry anymore. She slept with fuller cheeks, slower breathing. Calder stood in the stable doorway, hat in his hand, watching the flicker of lantern light on Hazel's face as she rocked Mabel and whispered a story about stars. The snow fell harder now, but inside the stable, it was warm with something unspoken. He stepped back into the darkness and shut the door behind him. In town, someone had scratched a word into the side of the merchant's wall. Hazel saw it the next morning. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. But that night, when Calder brought fresh bread and a spool of thread, she looked at him and whispered, They'll never forgive me for needing help. And Calder, who had once buried a wife with his own hands, who hadn't believed in second chances in over a decade, just said, Let them choke on it. And from the stable behind him, Ruth laughed, a sound so full of life it might have melted the snow. Calder didn't laugh back, but he didn't leave either. The stable groaned under night's burden. Beams creaked when wind fought against them, and somewhere in the corner, a hen rustled softly in slumber. Hazel sat with her back against the stall wall, legs tucked beneath her skirt, the baby pressed warm against her chest. Mabel had finally surrendered to sleep, and Hazel didn't weep. She had once loud, raw sobs into a riverbank that couldn't contain them. She had cried when Earl first struck her, when Ruth stopped calling her mama and instead whispered, "Don't wake him." She had cried when Elma's doll was cast into the flames, when Jonas ceased speaking, and when Silas asked if dinner meant chewing water again. But now, with Mabel sleeping and the others breathing steadily around her, Hazel simply sat motionless. She couldn't afford the vulnerability. Outside, frost decorated the windows. Calder Boone's lantern swayed in the yard as he crossed to the stable. He never entered without announcing himself. That mattered. A small gesture, but it mattered. When Hazel opened the door, he stood holding a pail and a long strip of canvas. "Figured that wall leaked tonight," he said. "Storm's shifting." She stepped aside. The children slept in a line on a pile of blankets and hay. Small bodies curved like punctuation marks around each other. Jonas had his arm draped protectively across Elma, though he himself hadn't spoken since the week they escaped. Calder moved slowly, respectfully, laying the canvas against the seam in the far wall where cold liked to find them. Hazel watched his hands, broad-palmed, careful, the kind of hands that had buried things but could still repair what sagged. "You always work this quietly?" she asked, voice barely above the fire's whisper. He paused, then looked up. "Noise doesn't make things faster, just louder." Hazel smiled at that, not with her mouth but in the corner of her eyes. He returned to the wall, pressed the last nail in with his palm's heel. "Your boy," he said. "Jonas." She waited. "He ain't sick, is he?" She shook her head. "Not in the body." "Spoke before?" "Yes, softly. He loved birds. Called them friends." Calder nodded. "Still watches everything. That's how I know he's in there," she said, still listening. The stable quieted again. Calder straightened, stretched his back, and looked around. "I've got a pot of stew on. If you don't mind stew that tastes more like bark than beef." Hazel glanced at the sleeping children. He caught the look. "Bring them or come after they sleep. Doors open." He left without waiting for her answer. That was his way. No pressure, no questions, just space. Hazel waited until Ruth stirred and turned over, then tucked the baby deeper into the quilt and walked softly toward the house. The snow had slowed, flakes falling like feathers now, catching in the light that spilled from the windows. Inside, warmth lived in the floorboards. The house didn't speak, but it held breath like it remembered the last family it sheltered and didn't want to forget. Calder sat at the table with 2 bowls and a pot between them. A loaf of bread already sliced sat nearby. "I didn't wait," he said almost apologetically. "I didn't expect you to." She sat, smoothed her skirt, and took the spoon. For a while they ate in silence. Hazel glanced up once and found him watching her. Not in a way that weighed, but in a way that said he hadn't had company in years and was trying to remember how it worked. "Where'd you learn to thatch?" he asked finally. "Church roof," she said. "Papa was a preacher. Small congregation. We did things ourselves." He nodded. "Didn't know he had a daughter." "He didn't advertise me." "Why?" "Because I ran," she said, not bitterly. "Just true." He leaned back, the wood of the chair creaking. "You ran and then?" "Then I loved the wrong man. Had children the town never wanted. Lived quiet, then loud, then quiet again." Calder's fingers drummed against the edge of the table. "I buried my wife 7 years back," he said. "Complications at birth. Lost the child, too." Hazel closed her eyes. "I'm sorry." "Wasn't your doing." "No," she said softly, "but I know the sound a house makes when it stops being filled with laughter." He looked up at her then, something shifting in his jaw. A memory or a mercy. "You can stay longer," he said low. "No rent. Just help me keep the place from rotting. Even when they start whispering, they already are. You'll take in a ruined woman with 5 mouths to feed. I'll take in the ones with eyes that looked at me like that girl did behind the butcher's." Hazel blinked. "And I'll ignore the rest," he said. She stood after that, gave him back his bowl, said "thank you," with a nod. He watched her go. By morning, Hazel had scrubbed half the stable floor. Ruth carried water from the pump. Elma sorted the bent nails Calder gave her, putting the straight ones in one box, the bent in another. Jonas followed Calder wordlessly, mimicking his walk, carrying scraps of wood like they were precious. Silas found the old rocking horse near the shed, painted. He rode it like a stallion. Mabel stayed with Hazel, tucked beneath her shawl, soft against her heart. Days passed. The wind turned sharp. Boots arrived for the children. Hazel tried to return them, but Calder wouldn't take them. They'll outgrow them, he said. No use returning. Hazel washed the children's clothes in melted snow, dried them by the fire Calder let them use during daylight. She stitched new seams into Ruth's skirt and sewed a patch into Calder's sleeve when she saw the tear. He didn't mention it, but she saw him wear it more. Then came the butcher's boy, sent to deliver scraps and bread ends from the back door as a sort of gesture to clear Calder's name with townfolk. The boy, sneering, tossed the bag at Ruth's feet. "Don't eat it all at once, little rats." Hazel stepped forward before Ruth could answer. Her voice was calm, but her face was stone. "Tell your father we're not charity," she said. "Tell him we eat what we earn." The boy paled and ran. Calder found out and didn't speak for an hour. Then he handed Hazel a small sack of coin. "Buy what you want." She shook her head. "They'll look at me like I stole it. Then I'll walk beside you." She stared at him. "That makes it worse." "Then I'll walk behind." She didn't smile, but she did take the coin. Later that week, Jonas stood beside Calder as he chopped wood. He mimicked the motion with a stick. Calder said, "You want to try?" Jonas didn't speak. Calder handed him the smallest axe. Together they lifted. One log split clean. Hazel watched from the stable and felt something old shift in her. It wasn't love yet, but it was safety. Safety that had shape and name and stood beside her boy without asking him to speak. That night, Ruth climbed onto Calder's porch. "You left this," she said, holding a carving, a rough horse chiseled with care. "I made it," she added. Calder nodded. "It's good." He placed it on his mantle that evening, left it where the sun hit it in the morning. Hazel noticed. Weeks folded like letters. Quiet, deliberate, full of unsaid things. Then came the night Mabel stopped crying at all. She just lay there breathing, but so still. Hazel wrapped her, held her tight, rocked. Her lips pressed to Mabel's head. She didn't cry. Calder sat near, eyes wide. "Is she?" "She's resting," Hazel said, voice brittle. "Just resting." And then Mabel stirred. Tiny fingers twitched. A sigh escaped. Hazel's shoulders fell. She kissed the child's head and tucked her close. Calder's breath held too long. Finally let it out. He didn't say a word. Hazel didn't look up. She just said softly, "She only ever stops crying when she feels safe." Calder didn't answer. But the next morning when Hazel stepped outside, she saw something she hadn't in years. A small painted sign on the stable wall. Just one word, mercy. Nailed there clean and true. The same word Hazel once scratched into her wedding Bible before fleeing into the dark. She looked toward the house and Calder watched her from the window, waiting to see what she'd do next. The first spring thaw came quietly, softening the earth without warning. Snow sank into mud. Smoke thinned at chimney tops. Sap ran slick along the bark. And still, Hazel hadn't stepped over the threshold of Calder's house. She swept the porch. She mended the stable roof. She washed Calder's shirts in a tin tub without being asked, her hands red and raw by dusk. But she never sat in the armchair he offered, never drank from the second mug he set by the stove. She stayed like she belonged to no one, not even herself. Calder watched without pressing. He spoke more now, but always with space between the words. Room enough for her to stay or leave, or break apart quietly. Sometimes she'd nod and answer and nothing else, and that seemed to be enough for him. The children settled into the ranch like dust into grain grooves. Ruth tended the chickens before sunup. Elma arranged pine cones by height on the windowsills, naming them like dolls. Jonas began humming tunelessly, just enough to make the air feel full. Silas tried on Calder's boots when he wasn't looking, leaving muddy footprints the size of his dreams. Mabel, now with cheeks plump from stew and sleep, learned to laugh. Still, Hazel kept one hand on the doorframe, as if the world might yank her back by the hair at any moment. At the general store, whispers still followed her. That preacher's daughter, she's ruined, they say. Married a gambler, then a drifter. Children by each. Calder's letting them sleep in his stable. Fool's going soft. Hazel didn't look up, just placed her coin on the counter, collected salt and flour, and walked out into the sun, her back straight. Calder met her at the gate that afternoon. "Store give you trouble?" he asked. "No more than usual." He didn't press, just opened the gate wider. "Got time to help mend the east fence? I'll pay you for the time." Hazel tilted her head. "You trust me to earn?" Calder shrugged. "You already have." They walked together past the edge of the pasture, where wildflowers strained toward the new light. Hazel held the wire steady while Calder drove in nails. Her hands were sure, her silence steady. He paused once, caught her watching a hawk circle overhead. "My wife used to say spring feels like forgiveness," he murmured. Hazel didn't look at him. "Forgiveness is slower than that." Calder nodded once and said, "No more." That evening, Ruth laid a wooden carving on the porch rail. A bird this time, sharp-beaked, wings tucked mid-glide. "She made it for you," Hazel said, arms crossed. Calder looked at the piece, then at Ruth. "Thank you." Ruth smiled, quick and proud, then ran off barefoot into the yard. Hazel lingered. "You can keep it," she said after a while. "I plan to—" Hazel turned. "You shouldn't?" "Why not?" "Because they'll think I'm trying to buy a place here." "You already earned one." She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. She stepped off the porch instead, her skirt brushing the grass like an apology. That night, thunder rolled on the horizon. Calder brought extra firewood to the stable, set it by the stove Hazel had lit herself. "You ever sleep inside?" he asked. She didn't answer. "Not since he left." Hazel's face hardened. "I don't owe you those memories." "I know," Calder said, "but sometimes they get lighter when you share the weight." Hazel looked down at Mabel, asleep in her arms. "I carried her through a river once," she said. "We were hiding from Earl. I slipped. Thought I'd lost her. Thought she'd float away like the rest of me had. But I grabbed her shawl." She swallowed hard. "I never cried, not even after. I just kept walking." Calder's voice dropped. "That's not shameful." She looked up at him, startled. "Shame's what people make when they want to feel bigger than you," he said. "You ain't shameful. You're surviving." Hazel said nothing, but she didn't look away. The next day, Calder left a new spool of thread and 2 jars of preserves at the stable door. Ruth found them, then found Hazel. "He left it for us," she said. Hazel pressed her lips together. "Nothing is free." Later, she stitched new cuffs on Calder's shirts. Didn't leave a note, just hung them on the rail to dry. By week's end, word had spread that the sheriff had been by the saloon asking questions. "Calder's got squatters now. They're not his wards. Maybe he's gone mad. That preacher's daughter cursed that whole place." Hazel heard it whispered at the well. She returned to the ranch with a storm in her lungs. "You're making enemies for nothing," she said to Calder as he hoisted a feed sack. They were never friends to start. "You think it don't matter what they say?" "I think truth lives quieter than gossip." Hazel narrowed her eyes. "You'll regret letting us stay." Calder set the feed down, stepped closer. "You think I haven't known regret before?" Hazel's breath hitched. "I buried a wife and a child the same day. I let a midwife walk out because I thought I knew better. That regret lives behind my ribs. You," he said gentler now, "you and those kids, you've done nothing to deserve it." She swallowed hard. "We won't be a burden." "You already aren't." That night, as lightning forked the sky, Hazel stood by the stable door, watching the house through silvered rain. A faint glow came from the window where Calder read by lamp. Behind her, the children slept. She didn't enter the house, but she stepped off the porch and stood beneath the storm until her hair clung to her neck and the wet felt like baptism. In town, a group of men talked about handling the Boone problem. One of them, a cousin of Earl's, had seen Hazel carrying Mabel and said, "She's dangerous the way poison seeps through a well." The next morning, Hazel was in the garden planting onions when Calder approached with a slip of paper. Sheriff's coming next week, he said. Wants to talk about property rights. Hazel stood. He'll take us only if I let him. She wiped her hands on her apron. And will you? Calder looked at her. You stayed like you belonged to no one. But this land knows your hands now. So do I. She stared at him, eyes shining. That doesn't mean we're safe. No, he said, but maybe it means we're home. Hazel turned toward the stable. The children were laughing inside. Ruth was teaching Jonas to whistle, failing, but trying all the same. Home, Hazel repeated like the word had corners she hadn't touched yet. She walked toward the house. Calder stood at the gate watching her, and as the wind lifted the hem of her skirt, she paused, hand resting on the fence rail. If they come, I won't let them take you. And if they bring law, Calder's voice was calm, then we show them mercy is not a crime. Hazel held his gaze. She didn't smile, but she didn't walk away either. The wind had finally stilled. After weeks of rattling shutters and shaking pine branches against the eaves, the quiet came like a held breath. The house no longer moaned. It listened. Hazel stood barefoot in the kitchen, apron dusted with flour, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She stirred a pot of beans with one hand, rocked Mabel with the other. A strand of hair slipped from her braid and clung to her cheek. Outside, Ruth fed the hens. Jonas was stacking rocks like fences near the porch. The others scattered like dandelions across the land, chasing warmth where they could. The stable had grown too small. Calder offered the house 2 nights ago, not with words but with an open door and a second fire lit. Hazel had hesitated, hovering at the threshold as if some invisible rope still tied her to weather and wood smoke. But when Elma began to cough in the chill, Hazel stepped inside, bundled them all in quilts, and stayed. Now, in the soft rhythm of domestic things, something ancient stirred. She began to hum. The tune was old, older than memory. A hymn her mother used to sing when sweeping before sermons, after tears. Hazel barely realized she'd let it slip from her mouth. But Calder, hammering in the far room, paused mid-swing. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound drifted down the hallway like morning light. She didn't stop. The house, which had long been quiet as a chapel after burial, now exhaled. Later, Calder entered the kitchen. Hazel wiped her hands, startled. Sorry, she murmured, suddenly self-conscious. He shook his head. House was warmer when you sang. She looked at him, eyes wide, unsure. I mean it, he said. Hazel folded the cloth on the table. My mama used to say women sing when they start remembering who they are. Calder leaned against the doorframe. And you? I don't remember yet, she said, but the notes come easy. That night, Ruth read out loud from a weathered Bible, while Calder carved pine slats for the porch railing. The fire popped behind them, and Elma rested her head in Hazel's lap, fingers tangled in the folds of her dress. Jonas stared into the flames like they held all the words he couldn't say. The air was full of small sounds. A chair shifting, the scrape of wood, Ruth's voice stammering on long words. Hazel listened, her hands never still, smoothing curls, folding sleeves, keeping the quiet full of care. You don't flinch anymore, Calder said quietly, eyes on his carving. Hazel looked up. Used to when the door shut or boots hit the steps. She swallowed. I still feel it, she said. It just doesn't show. Calder nodded. That's strength. Hazel gave a small laugh. It's survival. Different thing. He didn't correct her, just turned the knife back to the wood. Outside, wind pressed softly at the windows as if asking permission. The next morning, town felt colder again. A woman in a shawl whispered to Hazel at the well, loud enough for Ruth to hear. Men don't marry shadows, dear, especially not ones with other men's children. Hazel said nothing. Neither did Ruth, but her hands trembled as she drew water. Back home, Ruth refused lunch. Hazel sat beside her. Say it. Ruth's eyes filled. They hate us. Hazel brushed hair from her brow. That's not yours to carry. It's yours, she whispered, but I feel it too. Hazel's throat tightened. She couldn't lie. That evening, she stood in the hallway and watched Calder adjust the hinges on the back door. Do you regret it? She asked. He looked up. Regret what? Letting us stay? Letting them talk? His eyes lingered on her face. I regret not building a better world for you to walk into, but I don't regret holding the door. Hazel leaned against the frame. You think the sheriff's still coming? He'll come. Town's breathing down his neck. What will you do? Calder wiped his hands. What I should have done years ago. She opened her mouth, but the baby cried. I'll warm her milk, she said, disappearing into the kitchen. He watched her go, a quiet line settling in his brow. 2 days later, the cough came back. Elma's chest rattled like a cracked lantern. Hazel sat with her all night, cloth soaked in thyme and vinegar pressed to her brow. Calder brought hot bricks wrapped in wool. Ruth read psalms aloud. Jonas stayed close. She needs a doctor, Calder said. Hazel shook her head. Dr. Fields won't come. Not for us. Calder saddled his horse at dawn. When he returned, the doctor followed with a bag and a grim look. I'll do what I can, he said, not unkindly. The room turned to prayer. Elma pulled through by evening. Her breath slowed. Her color returned. Hazel wept then, for the first time in years. Not loud, not wild, just steady tears that slid into the folds of her dress. Calder touched her shoulder. She didn't pull away. She's stronger than she looks, he said. Hazel looked at him through salt-blurred lashes. They all are. He knelt. So is their mother. The moon rose soft that night, casting light through the kitchen windows where Hazel stood alone, staring at the quiet table. Her hands traced the grain of the wood. Every board Calder had placed with purpose, a home-built plank by plank like trust. She began to sing again. The tune filled the house. It settled into corners untouched by light for years. Calder, standing in the darkened hallway, closed his eyes. In her voice there was pain and peace, and the unsteady rhythm of someone beginning to believe in something better. In town, the sheriff packed his saddle. He was riding out at dawn. The first heavy snow of winter fell without sound, swallowing the fields and silencing the hills. It came at dawn when even the crows had yet to stir, blanketing the world in white as if to cover what it couldn't cleanse. Calder stood at the window, his breath fogging the pain, eyes tracking the slow rise of the storm. Behind him, Hazel moved quietly, wrapping Mabel tighter against her chest. They'll come today, he said. Hazel didn't answer, but her hand moved instinctively to Ruth's shoulder as the girl entered the room, cheeks still flushed from sleep. Jonas sat by the hearth, carving nothing in particular into a block of wood, his lips pressed tight. Elma coughed in her sleep. Silas stared at the snow with wide, knowing eyes. None of them asked what Calder meant. They already knew. The sheriff had given no time, just a promise passed through the saloon. He'd ride out once the weather turned, once the town had decided enough was enough. 5 children, 1 woman, no blood ties, no papers, and a man with too much land and too few words. Offering them all shelter like that alone didn't stir suspicion. Calder had fought wars and buried a wife and built fences tall enough to keep coyotes out, but not talk. He'd rebuilt roofs, replaced windows, and watched cattle birth in the dark. But nothing prepared him for how small Hazel looked that morning in the firelight. How still she stood, already bracing for a fight she didn't want him to fight for her. I can go, she said quietly, eyes fixed on the child in her arms. No, Calder said. You can't. You don't owe us anything. I didn't do this because I owed you. I did it because it was right. She turned toward him then, something breaking in her eyes that had held too long. If they take us, you'll be shamed. I was already shamed, he said, when I buried my family and stopped speaking to the world. Let them say what they want. They've already said worse. A knock cracked the silence, not loud but firm. Ruth jumped. Jonas dropped his knife. Hazel closed her eyes. Calder opened the door. The sheriff stood with 3 men behind him, 2 deputies and a rancher Hazel recognized from town. One who'd never met her eyes unless to glare. They wore expressions shaped by duty but softened by snow, unsure whether mercy or menace suited the moment best. Calder, the sheriff said, voice wrapped in civility, we got concerns. Got word that you're sheltering a woman and 5 children not kin to you. I am. You signed no guardianship, no marriage record. That makes it unlawful. They're here by my invitation. The sheriff cleared his throat. That ain't how the law works. It's how decency works. One of the deputies shifted his stance. The wind blew harder now, snow collecting on their hats and shoulders. I'd like to speak to the woman, the sheriff said. Calder didn't move. You speak to me? We can't do that, Boone. Law says she has to speak for herself. Hazel stepped forward then, the baby bundled tightly against her. I'll speak, she said, but not to defend myself. The sheriff gave a nod. My name is Hazel Mercy. These are my children, born from pain, raised with little, but never stolen. We've lived like ghosts. We've slept under barns and in hollows. I've been called names that would crack your spine to hear, but I have never harmed a soul. I've asked for nothing until the day this man opened his door. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It was steady, plain, and full of earth. I came here starving. My children were eating garbage. I asked for bread. He gave us land. I didn't ask for pity. He gave us dignity. And now you want to take that from us. The sheriff's gaze faltered. I won't fight you, Hazel said, but I won't walk out of here ashamed. Not anymore. Behind her, Ruth moved to Calder's side. Jonas followed. Elma stepped beside her mother. Silas wrapped his arms around Hazel's skirt and held on like it was the only thing left that mattered. Calder's voice broke the moment. She bears my name. The sheriff frowned. Say again. She bears my name, Calder repeated. As of this morning. He stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his coat. I signed the license with Reverend Bell before dawn. Hazel Boone. The children, too. This is their home now, same as it's mine. The deputy stepped forward, took the paper, read it slowly. Well, the sheriff muttered, scratching the back of his neck, that changes things. The wind howled behind them. Guess it does, said the rancher beside him, less pleased. The sheriff nodded once. If it's legal, then it's settled. We'll be going. He tipped his hat to Hazel. Ma'am? They turned and left, boots crunching through snow, shoulders hunched, not from cold, but from something heavier. The door closed. Hazel stood motionless. You didn't have to, she said softly. I did, Calder answered. Not to protect you from them, to tell them you're mine. Ruth wept first, quiet, sudden, her face buried in Calder's side. Jonas stood like stone, then reached for Calder's hand. Elma climbed into Hazel's arms and pressed her face to her neck. Silas grinned wide enough to show the missing tooth he'd been hiding. Later that night, Hazel sat in the rocker by the hearth. Mabel slept heavy in her lap. Ruth dozed on the rug with Jonas curled beside her. Elma hummed softly while playing with buttons. Silas clutched a pine cone like a treasure. The house breathed warmth. Calder stood in the doorway watching them. You married me in name, Hazel said. I married you in winter, he said. That's when things bloom slow but deep. She looked at him. And in spring? We build, he said. Together. He crossed the room, took Mabel from her arms, careful not to wake her. Hazel leaned into the silence, into the man, into the warmth. Outside, snow kept falling, but it no longer felt like a burial. It felt like a beginning.